All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Azul Beginner to Master series. This is episode 11, I believe. And before I jump into games, I did want to just go over some of the strategies that we've been using or things that we've been thinking about. Um, Basically, I realized that um, the written guide is obviously incomplete and um, covered only a subset of what we're actually doing in the games. And then, when we're in the games, sometimes it's not always clear what the more holistic strategies are because I'm just kind of talking as I go. So I did take some notes and hopefully this is readable. Um, and I'll just quickly go through these, and then we'll jump into some games. So, in terms of macro strategy, we are still just sticking with the baseline plan of 2 rows and 1 column, and then we are opportunistically threatening a second column or a color bonus. And we can actually look at our Azul stats and see that points gained with complete lines is at 3.38. So we actually finish on average less than 2 rows per game. Points gained with complete columns, 7.3. So we're just over 1 column per game. And then points gained with complete color is 0.87, which I think is probably, complete color once every less than 1 in 10 games, right? So maybe 1 in 15 games or something. So we are sticking with this. I talked about it a couple videos ago, but minor preference for building column number 2. And the logic there was just that it's hard to defend red. And I'll pull up a board. It'll be useful just to have a board to reference, but it can be hard for opponents to defend against row 5 red when their columns don't need red. Usually just need the top row or the second row red. But you can look at, maybe it's episode 6 for more details on that. And then we are never building on the edges, and especially not on the right edge. And in the last couple of episodes, I had a lot of opponents who did that. And so you can reference those episodes for how that can get you in trouble. I'm starting to think that the left edge maybe isn't so bad, but certainly the right edge you never want to do. And then lastly, just keep track of tile counts if you're comfortable with it. That's something we've been doing since episode 3 or so. And, it's definitely helpful in the end game scenarios in particular. Okay. So in round 1, and some of this stuff is like building column 2 is sort of a round 1 thing, but so the first thing about round 1 is, in general, we've been more interested in making progress on rows 4 and 5 than getting specific colors in rows 1 and 3. So a lot of people have the idea that they should try to build a stack in row 1 to 3, or maybe a zigzag, or 2 and then 1. But what we've been doing is trying to make progress on the bottom rows and not particularly worrying about what our top 3 rows look like. We definitely want to get the top 2 rows and the third row if we can. But if it's, a black and a blue, that's not the end of the world. We kind of figure that stuff out later in the game. So, it's nice to get positions where you have easy adjacency in your top two rows, but we've been more focused on making progress on the bottom rows. Now, that being said, when going second, I've noticed some of these things are interesting that like when I was thinking about this list, kind of thinking about themes in my play that I don't necessarily consciously know about. But one thing I've noticed is that when I'm going second, I'm pretty frequently taking the first player tile and then like selecting what column I'm going to build and what rows 4 and 5 I'm going to focus on based on reacting to my opponent choices. So I was going to say we can play this game, but so like here, for example, maybe I take some reds, but I'm going to guess like I take this one black from the center. Of course I don't. So bad example. But yeah, frequently in the games, I have been taking the first player tile and then just reacting to my opponent. And of course, it depends on the draw. This one, I think I'm kind of reacting to my opponent building. Actually, I remember this game. This is one where my opponent builds on the right edge. And so I think what I was saying was when your opponent's building on the right edge, yellow is like a really high priority color for them. So I just went straight into yellows. So not the best example of this, but that's why it says frequently taking the first player tile and not always, right? So we're never going to hold to any strategy in all cases. And then one of the big ones I've been talking about is never having your rows 4 and 5 be misaligned, which is to say they belong to different columns. And you also don't want to misalign your row 3 if you can't complete it. So if I complete this row 3 yellow in this example, I'm still fine to build, the second column or the third column. But if I can't complete the row 3 yellow, or if I'm not confident I can complete the row 3 yellow, I shouldn't plan on building one of these other columns. And we saw some examples, I think, in the last episode where our opponent got themselves into trouble on row 3, and it cost them later in the game. Now, the exception is that if you can complete row 4 or 5, then it can be okay to be misaligned. We haven't done this in any games, but basically the idea is, so for example, this draw has very few whites. So you can be reasonably confident that there's going to be a lot of whites in the next round. So maybe, for example, I complete row 4 yellow, but then I decide to play some row 5 black because I think I'm going to be able to build the center column with these whites. Again, we haven't done this. It's not something I would necessarily recommend, but if you can complete one of those rows, you could misalign the other one. But certainly if you can't complete one, this is a no-no for me at least. And then just a reminder, like if you are focused on rows 4 and 5 early in round 1, just be very careful not to get stuck not being able to play on row 1 or 2. So there's been a couple of situations where maybe I go to make a play and then I realize like, oh, I can't do that because if they respond in a certain way, I won't be able to get my row 2. So, always be aware of that. And then lastly is don't be afraid to take negatives in round 1. So the idea here is round 1 scoring tends to be pretty low. So like it's better to be down 0 to 2 and have your opponent with no tiles on row 5 than be winning 3 to 2, but your opponent has 4 tiles on row 5. So you're sacrificing some minor number of points to significantly inhibit your opponent's ability to build a column. Okay, so that's round one. Rounds 2 to 4. So rounds 2 to 4 are really like the meat of an Azul game. Um, and everything, like I couldn't possibly write everything down that you need to consider. So this is a big list, but I tried to kind of highlight some of the important points and some of the things that have come up a lot in my videos. So the first thing is to always assess the tile draw and develop a rough plan before making a play. Um, Even if the first play seems obvious, still take the time to do this. So, for one, it kind of prepares you mentally for the rest of the round, um, and two, sometimes a play seems obvious, but I can't tell you how many times my opponent has, like, the tiles get dealt, they instantly pick their tiles, and I think to myself, like, I wasn't going to defend those anyway. Um, you know, Maybe there was a different play. Um, so I see people very frequently kind of rushing through games, and I think it's pretty critical to make a plan at the beginning of every round and understand what your priorities are. So, how do you do that? Um, I kind of lumped in. I didn't want to write too much about like the tiles you need, what tiles your opponent needs. These things I think should be relatively obvious. The real question here is like, what is a need versus a nice to have, maybe. Um, but I think we'll kind of get into that. Um, so, one of the first things I like to think about is like understanding whether this tile draw lends itself to me playing offense or me playing defense. Um, and basically, like, if you have no good options to build your own board, you should probably shift your focus to defending against your opponent's building. And that doesn't mean like go all out, but um, you are probably going to have to make some sacrifices uh, to prevent them from like significantly outscoring you. Um, and the alternative is, if you have good offensive options, try to do both. So when you don't have good offensive options, focus on defense. But when you do have good offensive options, this is where you can really maximize around. And this has been like a core part of how we've been winning games. Um, and I'll get to basically how we've been doing this further down. Um, the other thing to understand is like understanding your priorities with respect to the score of the game and your path to winning. So if you are down by a ton of points and maybe your opponent like can't play any blue tiles, their rows are jammed up so they can't play any blue tiles, maybe, you know, 2 blue on your row 2 is really nice for you, but actually the best way for you to get back into the game is to dump as many blue tiles on your opponent as possible. So maybe you make a suboptimal pick on row 2, um, with the intent of giving your opponent a bunch of negatives at the end of the round. So that's kind of one thing, or you could try to set yourself up for a second column or a color bonus. And then on the flip side, if you're winning comfortably, like, you need to avoid those other situations. So figuring out where you're vulnerable to big negatives and, making sure that you don't get stuck with those. So um, the score of the game, the context of the game kind of matters to how you might approach a round, specifically if you're like way ahead or way behind. If it's a close game, then you're kind of just looking for the optimal option, but you might have to like take some risks in the event that you're down by a lot. Okay, this is one that another one that I've kind of realized as I've been making the series that comes up a lot, which is identifying where we're flexible in a round. Um, and this can be pretty crucial to not getting stuck with negatives. Um, so we've been looking at cases where we have options for our row 2 adjacency or options for our row 1 adjacency, um, and kind of not committing early when we have options. And that way, like as we go through the round, we can change our plan, we can adapt to what our opponent's doing, and we can take less risk with getting stuck with negatives, because we have multiple paths. So I'm going to try to highlight this more in the videos, I think, because I do think it's kind of a big deal. Like a lot of times I see players um, like take 2 tiles and play them on row 4 when there's not really any need to commit to that, or um, they have some better options maybe, but there's this tendency to, like, if there's a group of tiles, people want to take the group and play the group because it gives them an opportunity to complete a row. But sometimes the best play is to just take 1 tile for your top row and then see what your opponent does and react to it. So I think this is a big one. Another one that's kind of key is like identifying any colors that are free for you, which is to say that your opponent can't play them anywhere. And these are tiles that you can let group in the middle because you can either play them for yourself at the end of the round, or you can try to stick your opponent with them. So it's almost a flexibility thing as well, but being able to not worry about a certain color gives you a lot of flexibility or control over a round. And then lastly is, like, based on this draw, how important is it that you get the first player tile? And there's some nuance to that, but kind of the main question is, like, are there going to be critical colors to control in the next round? So maybe you're stuck, you need black to complete your row 5, and there's only 6 black left, so like you really want the first player tile, so you have the first choice of blacks next round. Okay, so that's all of that is assessing the draw and making a plan. It's a lot, but with practice, you get through it pretty quickly. So some other strategies in rounds 2 and 4. Defending doesn't always mean taking the tiles your opponent needs. And this goes back to if you have good offensive options, try to play offense while also playing defense. So you don't always want to sacrifice your offense just to take tiles that your opponents need. So instead of doing that, if you can create a group of tiles that's larger than what they need, that is to say, if they need 2 yellows to complete a row, and you create a group of 4 yellow, and they have to take those negatives, that is a form of defense as well. And it can let you build at the same time that you play defense, because you're not taking those yellows yourself and sacrificing points potentially. You are making a play that benefits you at the same time as hurting your opponent. Very similar to this is to try to find forcing moves. And I'd say this is another, like, pretty key part of our strategy. So when you give your opponent no options or no good options, it can snowball, and one forcing move can lead to another forcing move, and you just kind of continually take away all of your opponent's options and force them into bad options. So what does a forcing move look like? Could be you take something they need and they only have one more of that color available, so they kind of have to take it. Or it can be this situation of grouping tiles. So creating groups where, they have to take these yellows now or the group's going to get even bigger, or even threatening to create groups. So if there's yellow on two different factories and you move some of those yellows to the middle, maybe your opponent kind of has to take yellow now, because if they don't, you're going to put the other yellows in the middle and then it's going to be a really big group. So I'll try to highlight these as I play today as well. And then lastly is to always be aware of the end of round sequence, and opportunities to force it into your favor. And this is especially true if you're at risk of taking big negatives, or if your opponent is at risk of taking big negatives. So I'd say this is probably one of the most, if not the most important skill in Azul. You can be winning by 10, and if you get stuck with a minus 11 or a minus 14 round, there goes your game. So being able to mitigate risk and create problems for your opponent with negatives is huge. And the end of the round is when that tends to come to fruition, when the ending sequence is forced. There's no more factories, and it's just my turn, your turn, my turn, or your turn, my turn, your turn, your turn. And this is another reason to be flexible. So being flexible lets you control this better than if you've kind of used up a bunch of rows and you don't have anywhere to play anything. Round 5 is a little bit, I didn't write a lot for round 5. It's more deterministic. So you can kind of like play out scenarios and calculate outcomes. But again, like, you have to understand your path to victory based on the current score. You might need to avoid negatives. You might need to force negatives on your opponent, or even try to force around 6. And similarly, like, if you're winning, you need to be able to identify that you're winning and not let the game go to round 6. And sometimes that's murky. Sometimes it's unclear if you're winning or not, or if you're going to win. And I've talked about in videos kind of some rules of thumb or rough math, so that you don't have to do in-depth calculation on the fly. You can just kind of look at how many tiles am I going to place versus how many tiles is my opponent going to place, and how many points ahead am I? Do we have the same bonuses, etc. And then lastly, since this happened to us in a game, double check threats from your opponent, like second columns or color bonuses. So earlier in the series, I missed that my opponent got a color bonus. Fortunately, we still won that game. But yes, you always have to be aware of this, because they can sneak up on you. So that's the list. I'll post the link to this doc, or I'll just post the list directly in the comments. But for now, let's jump into some games. We are at 482. So I'm really hoping that we can get to expert today. And then the next episode will begin the expert games. Okay, we've got a 435. Oh, geez. Okay. So I think somewhat predictably, I'm going to invest in row 5 red here, and I'm going to pick the one that's a little bit less enticing for my opponent to take from the middle. They still do, which is good. Okay, so I don't like this play for my opponent. um, it gives me a very easy opportunity to block their row 3. So I would have just played this on row 1 and then, reacted. And maybe they're thinking like, oh, when I take 2 yellow, they'll take 2 red, but I'm fine with that. There's 3 more red. Okay, so there is an interesting opportunity for me to get row 3 blue. And like I said, I don't want to misalign my row 3 with my rows 4 and 5 if there's a risk that I won't complete it, but I can guarantee completing it. The risk of completing it is that everything else goes to the center, so there will be a group of 3 reds, and I might not get those. But my opponent doesn't have anywhere good to play them, so I am going to go for this. And the other thing that I'm going to do is I had an option there to take 1 blue instead of 2. And then I'm, guaranteed to complete the row with either of the remaining 2 blues. But because my opponent wants blue for row 4, I'm happy with the situation where I take 2 and then 2 again, and I burn 1 and reduce their ability to make progress on row 4. So a lot of the time, maybe in a later round when I don't want the negatives. Okay, so they throw away the blue, which is interesting. So there's a chance they'll pivot columns. I'm going to go ahead and complete this. And I'm pretty happy here no matter what, right? Like I either get the 3 red or the 2 black. Wow, so they're just dumping that. I think instead of dumping that, you might as well play it on row 1. Because if they play it on row 1, now they can take these 2 white for their row 5. Instead, they're pretty stuck here. I like that my opponent was willing to take those and make them negatives. We talked about not being afraid of negatives in round 1. I just think they should have played them on row 1. Okay, 14. Okay, so in terms of making a plan, our opponent's contesting us on row 5 black, row 5 red. I'm not too worried about it. I mean, there are only 8 reds left, so we definitely want to make progress, but I think what I'll do is secure the first player token so I can control reds next round and just take this one black. Okay, so row 2 is a bit tricky. We're kind of angling for 2 blue to come together, which our opponent could also use, or ending up with 2 white. There's a world in which we end up with 2 black, but that's not great. We'd prefer them on row 4. And then there's a realistic chance we get 3 yellow. So like I'm not going to do something like commit to my row 3 white because I don't want to get stuck there and end up potentially taking all these yellow negatives. So this is where we're staying flexible. And I'm just going to take a red for row 5. Okay, opponent takes a black. Let's look at a sort of forcing move. So by taking this black, our opponent doesn't have to take black, of course, so it's not forcing in that way, but it does help us. Now, there is a question as to whether to take this other black because it would group these 2 blues together for my opponent to get. The problem is I don't have very many other good plays. So maybe what I'll do is go for this row 3 yellow. And I have this option for whites for row 2. Okay, so Again, if I'm in my opponent's shoes, I would just play that on row 4. This is the column that you're building, so you should contribute to it. And now we get the nice situation of we complete our yellows, and we're guaranteed a row 2. So this is not like the ideal adjacency. And I think given the tiles in that round, we were in a bit of a crunch. Like there were only 2 blues and there were some reds, but our opponent started going after them. And then we also have our row 5 red priority. So sometimes you do just have to make do. So we're down by 3. And looking at this, so again, I definitely want to prioritize reds. White looks good for row 3. Our opponent probably wants black for their row 4. So one thing we could do is make a pretty aggressive defensive play that I think I like for a couple reasons. Basically, I don't want to feel pressured to take one of these single blacks later in the round. So now I just eliminate all pressure on black. Here, I think I just like grabbing these 2 blue. Again, there's 5 reds left, so we're running out. We do need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we need a lot of reds. So let's grab this one, and I'm gonna play it on row 1 to keep my adjacency instead of on row 5. So our opponent's building 4 white. It's not really anything to be concerned about. There are 9 whites left and we only need 3, so we're not in too much of a hurry, and this doesn't score many points for them, so I don't really feel the need to defend it. So we'll just continue with reds. And we probably will be down even further at the end of this round. And we get 2 of our whites here, so that's nice. We're going to take a lot of negatives, but we're close to competing our column, and our opponent didn't get too much points wise. So let's see what we can do. Two red is not unexpected, but definitely a bummer. Okay, so we know we're not getting row 2 red, so we'll take one of those for row 5. We don't need to rush into it though. We know our opponent still wants black, so probably going in on row 2 black. We need to pick up a white. It'd be nice to get these yellows, but I don't feel like they're in danger, so I don't need to prioritize those. And then there's like a bonus for blue if we can do it. So I think again I'm gonna overpay for these blacks, and okay, 1 red. So at this point I'm thinking maybe I give up on row 2 red altogether. So I'm not going to stress this red. If my opponent wants to defend it, that's fine. I'll definitely be able to get one in the next round, especially if I take the first player tile. So I'm guaranteed to finish my column more or less. And now thinking about the end of the round situation, like I need to be careful for these blacks. And I can guarantee that I won't get them by putting 4 colors in the middle. So I'm going to go ahead and do that with blue. Okay. So what I'm looking at now, if I take the blue and play it here on row 4, my opponent could take 2 yellow. But if they take 2 yellow, like they obviously want to play the blacks. They should play them on row 5. They want to play the blacks on row 5. And if they take the yellow first, I can take the black. Or if I take the white, they have to choose between row 2 and row 5. So this is a little bit risky because I do definitely want those yellows, and I could just play this blue on row 1. But I'm going to gamble that they're not going to take the yellow. Okay, so they take the yellow, they dump them. So let's think about this. There's 2 blacks left. So if I take all 4 of these, I'm pretty much guaranteed that they won't make a column. They will get these 3 whites though, so they will score 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So they'll score 12 minus 4. They'll go to 24. I will go to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 for 13. And then I'd go minus a bunch. 2, 4, 6, 9. So that'd be minus 11. So I'd be at like 7 points versus their 24. So that's almost unwinnable. Let's take the whites and force them to make a choice. Ooh. So that's an interesting choice. It is 4 points, but they've basically guaranteed they won't get a column. So I'm down by 13, and I need to assess if I can possibly win the game here. One thing to be careful for is I don't have anywhere to play yellows, so I need to watch out for that. Let's start with a yellow. We don't need to rush to grab a red. Okay, now let's try to group up these whites so that my opponent potentially has to pay for them. And again, we're going to be very mindful of the end of the round scenario, and we have guaranteed that we won't get the last tiles. So let's take a black, play it here. This is a little bit of a forcing move. Our opponent has to choose whether to take something or play the 2 red. Okay, we obviously take the 2 red. Okay, so here's worth calculating. So if I take the black, nothing happens for me. My opponent gets 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 points. Minus 3 is 3 points. If I take the white, I go minus 6, and my opponent can just play the black. So it's better to let them have the white. And this will be close. We're going to score a little bit better. And we're going to have a column, but it looks like this is going to be a dead tie. So nice game from my opponent. Maybe I played a little too aggressive of defense, but there were some tough draws in there for us. And yeah, happy to come away with a tie, honestly. Okay. So that was a situation where our opponent did successfully defend red. We got into some trouble. Okay, I guess we are in a game. That was weird. Okay, so we will get an opponent building on the edge. There's tons of red in the round, so there's no reason to try to defend that right away. So let's go for building the fourth column. We get a nice start here, and there's a fair amount of yellow. So we get the benefit of taking away from our opponent's row 5 yellow while building our row 3. So we'll be aggressive on the yellows here. Okay, so bit of a forcing move from our opponent. I think happy to do this. We're not at risk of not getting a row 2. There's plenty of options. Okay, so question here of what we want to secure. The thought around like taking blues here is it reduces the number of total blues we need for the rest of the game. Versus reds are like better for adjacency. Yeah, I think I'm actually going to take the blues. So when you're building column 4, there's a pretty heavy premium on blues because like normally you don't necessarily worry about row 3. And actually, let's follow the same logic and reduce what we need for whites. Yeah, so because row 3 blue is so strong and you're going to build row 2 and row 4 blue, it's good to get ahead of your blues. Of course, there are no blues this round. And a bunch of yellows this round, so my opponent is looking good, and 1 white. So, okay, so this is a terrible draw for us. Our opponent gets 3 black, our opponent can work on row 5 yellow. They can continue working on red if they want to like choose to build a color, and we have no blues and no whites. So not good. So how do we want to respond? One option is to like build row 4 yellow, and because there's only 2 blues anyway, so like maybe we're not going to make that much progress. And I like this option because we also have a shot at 3 red maybe, so we can actually earn some points here. So this is identifying the scenario that you're in, and this is not an offensive round for us. Okay, so I don't want to give my opponent 2 blue necessarily. So I don't want to take this yellow. I'm kind of interested in, this is tough. Like, I don't want my opponent to build full color red, and it's kind of already a threat. Okay, that's interesting. So they create 5 red. Yeah, I don't think I'm too, I don't want them to get it because it'll make full color red very easy. The question is, do I play it on row 2 or row 3? If I play it on row 2, there's a risk that I don't get my top 2 rows. I'm sorry, if I play it on row 3, there's a risk that I don't get my top 2 rows. Actually, I don't think that. Oh, the risk does exist because I have blue already. So I'm going to take this and play it on row 2. So this is another game where we're taking pretty heavy casualties early. Yeah, I'm happy to take 2 blue here and then pick whatever's left for my row 1. Yeah, so if I'm my opponent, I would have played that on row 5. All right, so we're down by 7. But the blues are coming in. Okay, so keeping an eye on row 2 yellow to hurt my opponent. Keeping an eye on this 1 red for my row 1, but I definitely need to make progress on blue. So I'm going to take the 2 blue that puts a yellow in the middle so that I can grab 2 yellow if my opponent chooses to take from either of these other 2 factories. Okay, takes 2 blue. Doesn't take 2 blue. So talking about free colors, my opponent has like free black, right? So they could actually consider building this middle column because more than likely they can collect these blacks. Okay, so yeah, let's grab these 2 blue. This prevents our opponent from row 2 blue. I think they would have been right to take the 2 instead of the 1. Because now, like, what are they going to defend my row 1? They just have to take this singular blue tile, which is awkward. Whereas if they had taken the 2, then they have a place to play a singular blue tile. Now they don't really have a place to play this. So, okay. We have some forcing moves here, so I could take these 2 white for my row 5. Presumably then my opponent takes the 2 white. And then I can get the row 3 yellow, and there will be a blue and a red left for my row 1. And if I take the white and then they take the white, there will be 4 colors in the middle, so I won't end up with these 5. So let's go for that. Now, my opponent can choose to stick us with these 5 blacks. So I'm aware of that. Basically, they can take 2 yellow or 1 yellow, and I'll be stuck with these 5 blacks. The reason I'm not too worried about it is I can play them on row 2, so it at least lessens the damage. And frankly, I think one of their better opportunities is this middle column. So they should potentially be thinking about using those black. Okay, so let's grab these yellows. And my opponent actually left themselves in a situation where their row 2 is going to be left vacant, most likely. And they choose to block the red, or I'm sorry, block the blue, but really, like, I was never going to play the blue there. Wasn't worth defending. I think actually the red is the thing worth defending. If you take the red, then I have to make the choice between row 1 and row 3. And row 1 is not good from an adjacency perspective, so. Okay, so this round should catch us up a bit. Yep, only down by 1 now. So 2 yellow heading into the next round. Not of great concern. Lots of blue, so we'll be fine there. So something I'll be looking at is if my opponent doesn't take this 2 white, I'll definitely think about playing 2 white on my row 2. And again, like, you know, always assess the situation, always have a plan. So some people might instantly take this 1 blue. But if you look at my opponent's opportunities to play it, it's not great. So obviously I want it, but I'm going to place a higher value or higher emphasis on working towards blocking these whites. And I have a lot of good places to play white. Obviously I need 1 more for row 5, and then I can even place him on row 4 and work on, you know, continuing to build this middle column for a good number of points. My opponent has a lot of options here. They could, you know, try to group blacks and reds and build column 2. So they choose to play defense. Now, I also need to be aware of blacks. So, for example, if I took 1 yellow here, my opponent would get 4 black and potentially be able to get the all black color bonus next round because there's 4 left. So I don't want to let that happen. So let's take the white, get the first player tile for round 5, and we can react to. So I don't like this actually because then our opponent can group the yellows together, and that's our only option for row 1. So let's do the yellow. We're going to pay some extra. But now if our opponent decides to go for blacks, we can react on row 4. And actually, now that we have the first player tile, this is less, all full color black is less of a threat because we need it for row 2, so we'll be able to do something there. Okay, so they go for it. Now, let's think about what we want to do. This actually kind of opens up white for us. So we potentially be able to play on row 4 white. A nice thing about this situation is that I can group the blacks and reds together. Um, and my opponent wants them, those are the only things they can play on row one. So I am going to make my opponent choose here. And they also have to, in fact, choose between red and black, presumably both of which they want for this second column. And if they choose black, I can play the four reds, and there's only three left, so they have no hope of finishing the column. So that's what we'll do. Okay, so we're up by one, but in reality, we know that our opponent can't finish a column. So we're actually up by 8 with our column bonus. And if we don't take 2 black here, then our opponent is guaranteed the color bonus. So we'll just go for 2 black. And this is a situation where there's basically no way my opponent can win. I have a lot of flexibility. I can play blue on row 5. I can play white on row 4. So the most abundant colors are not a threat to me, so I'm not going to go for big negatives. I've eliminated the only threat that my opponent has at a bonus. So additionally, they have gaps in their row 1 and row 2, so the points that they score here aren't going to be as much as I score in my rows 1 and row 2. So I basically know that this is a done deal, and just need to play safe. So you can see the power of the first player tile, and I was able to reason that I didn't need to defend this row 4 black because I had the first player tile and could stop this threat. Whereas if I did choose to defend the row 4 black, maybe I ended up taking all these reds, the row 4 reds, on my bottom line, and now I'm in trouble. So a little bit of thinking ahead. Okay, so yeah, we can just close out the game. My opponent does have this threat of building the center column if they're able to group these 4 whites. But like I said, we have row 4 for whites. So not that worried about it. Okay. So that should be a healthy win. Yep, 19-point win. So up to 487. And I have 100 karma points now. Okay. Unfortunately, I think I need to end the episode here. I was really hoping to get to expert today, but spent some time up front talking about strategies, and that tie unfortunately set us back. So yeah, we actually lost a couple points for that, which is unfortunate. But yeah, -2 for the tie, and then 7 for the win. So we only gained 5 this episode, but hopefully in the next one we will finally make it to expert, and then we'll open ourselves up to a big range of rating levels. So once we go into expert games, we could end up playing people at 650, 680, because it's a 200-point range. We'll get a big variety. So something to look forward to. Unfortunately, didn't make it this episode, but thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.